Katrina, thanks for joining me. Why don't you start by giving us a very brief overview of what the Animal Justice Party stands for, where it came from and where it's going?
Sure. Thanks for having me. The Animal Justice Party was formed in 2009 predominantly by a professor who was also a wildlife carer in the ACT, and he saw firsthand the damage that the kangaroo cull in that territory caused the local wildlife. He rescued them, he rehabilitated them, he released some of them again, often to have them, find them dead or injured again the next shooting season. So he realised that rather than trying to get the government of the day to do the bidding of the people who were rescuing and rehabilitating wildlife, it made more sense to form a political party whose sole focus was representing those animals and all other animals that call Australia and the waters that surround it home, and give them a political voice. So in 2009 he formed the Animal Justice Party, and then we were registered in 2011 nationally, and we've run in 3 federal elections since then, and we're now registered in every state and territory. So our key focus is to represent the rights and interests of non-human animals in Australia's parliamentary systems.
Very good. And in terms of your overarching mission, how difficult a task do you think do you have? Where are the challenges for the Animal Justice Party?
In some ways, it's quite simple because we understand that most Australians are against animal cruelty. Even if they don't realise they're complicit in it, most humans in Australia don't like to see animals abused or treated cruelly or hurt. But there's this disconnect from many industries within Australia that by their very existence have to cause harm and suffering to animals. And what we're trying to do is make the voting public aware of all those industries, of all the issues, of all the injustices that animals face, and ask them to use their vote, or their number one vote, to give us the power to make a difference for animals that are caught up in those industries, the industrial farming industries, the wildlife culling industries, for the safety of human practices where they cull sharks and shoot feral pigs and trap and poison all these animals that are affected by human activities and human desire to use the land that was once their habitat. We think that most people love wildlife, hate animal cruelty, and don't want to see the loss of nature in Australia. So we're counting on that to get their vote from them. On the other hand, it's very difficult because most MPs in Parliament and most governments have bigger problems on their hands. They think they see us, they see what we're all about as minor issues. When in fact, when you put everything together that we stand for, it equates to saving nature, saving the environment, and ultimately saving the planet that we also call home.
Yeah, this is really interesting because there's things that play off against each other. As you said, every Australian, most people in general, if you were to have the conversation with them, would say that they're against animal cruelty, they're against things that degrade and impact the environment. But yet, on the other hand, we find ourselves bound into behaviours and ways of doing things that are very hard to let go of. And so while having the conversation with people about their morals and their ethics, it's very easy to reach common ground there. But when it comes to putting things into action and requiring things to be changed, that's when you meet the resistance.
Sure.
Now, from your perspective, if you were to meet somebody who hasn't really given animal justice as a concept too much thought up to now, what would be the issue or the concept or the policy that you would introduce as an easy, accessible one to make them realise, okay, we both agree that this is a problem, but also this is what we need to do to try and solve the problem, and it will require you making some sacrifices, but you can now see that this would be a small win. Are there any kind of fairly accessible ones that would get people on board to what animal justice are trying to do, the sorts of ideas and initiatives?
I think the concept is that we have a parliamentary system, and that is, that churns out legislation that governs all facets of Australian life. Now, a majority of that legislation affects indirectly or indirectly or directly non-human animals and the environment and nature. But the animals that it affects has no vote. That's why we were formed. So I think when you point out to people, all of this legislation is passed in state and federal parliaments, and it affects animals by them being, slaughtered, trapped, poisoned, culled, run out of their homes, their habitats lost, culled in the oceans that they live in. They've got nowhere else to go. But they don't get a vote in whether that legislation passes or not. Most people understand that. I think probably the really easy one to get most people on side is factory farming. Even people that eat animals think that they should have a good life and be slaughtered humanely before they end up on their plate. Now, we recognise that you can't, there's no way to humanely take the life of someone who doesn't want to die, but certainly you can minimise the suffering while they're alive, and you can minimise the trauma involved in their slaughter, because pragmatically people are going to continue to eat animals for a while to go yet. So most people are happy to say, of course, why would you want an animal to suffer? Even if you want to eat it, you don't want it to suffer, and you want it to die as quickly and without trauma as possible. So that's a really easy one to get people on board. But we try to do that without wanting to seem welfarist, like we're not condoning the slaughter of animals. We're just saying it's going to happen. So while it's going to happen, let's minimise the suffering and the trauma that's associated with their life and their death.
Okay, so we put that argument forward to someone and they go, yes, I agree with you, factory farming is bad. If we were to make a change, what are the consequences of this? It's going to mean increased costs in the food production aspect and people ultimately bearing a higher cost for their food. And that's where the resistance, from my perspective, I'm just thinking, if I was to put this argument to to a group of people, given it is something that's easy to get people on board with conceptually, where does the pushback to an idea like trying to put more stringent regulations in place for factory farming, where does the resistance come from?
I think people do realise that to get high levels of welfare, to get less animals per square metre, the cost is going to rise for the producer. Now that cost is going to get passed on to the consumer. But when you factor in the health issues associated with the consumption of most animal products, there's also an incentive for the government to subsidise healthier food. It also, depends on what you consider food and not food, but to subsidise healthier plant-based food and alternatives to animal products, and to tax animal products that contribute to human health issues, diabetes, heart disease, cancer for dairy, a lot of red meat products, and arguably other non-red meat products. So what I don't know if it's we or if this is just my idea, but producers still want to produce, and there should be a standard level of care that they have to provide to each and every animal, and that is not, arbitrarily inspected by RSPCA inspectors when they get around to it, but regularly inspected. Those standards are upheld, and there are hefty penalties for deviating from them. That cost of the production of healthier, happier animals, even though I just reiterate we are opposed to the exploitation and commodification and slaughter of all animals. But while people eat them, the production of those healthier, happier animals with penalties in place for deviating from the standards, the cost of that is passed on to the consumer. The consumer, in turn, is going to probably eat less animal products and go more towards the alternatives that are becoming better and better, compared to just 10 years ago. The alternatives to animal products, both plant-based milks, plant-based cheeses, plant-based faux meats, and also the introduction of clean lab meats, so they're actually cellular meat grown from animal cells, is all going to become an alternative that should be subsidised, made cheaper, will become cheaper as more people buy them. So what I envisage is that the typical traditional animal production becomes less and less, while healthier, cleaner food alternatives rise, and consumers pay less for healthier food. I mean, what government wouldn't want their citizens paying less and eating healthier and health costs going down?
I would say potentially a government who had very close ties to
yes.
Companies who had alternative
ag industry, the animal ag industry.
Exactly, and that highlights the I suppose the challenge that you're up against, where you have a very noble cause that's grounded in ethics and morality that can be explained to people, where most people would get on board with the idea, but when it comes to the actual execution and implementation of what's required, we have all of these external factors coming into it: industry, the cost of food, the cost of living, the challenges that people face. Like straight away, it could be pushed back onto you that that your sorts of policies would be more to the detriment of poorer people who can't afford to make these lifestyle changes at this point in time.
But not if the alternative foods you're providing are cheaper and healthier. It's the same reason we still have fossil fuels, is because the industry, that props up the government has a vested interest in seeing that more fossil fuels are dug out of the ground. The animal agricultural industry has a vested interest in seeing that, beef and sheep and dairy farming continues. But we're not saying let's get all the farmers off the land. We don't want farmers walking off the land and the Chinese buying it and doing exactly the same thing, or the British or the Americans or whatever. We want to subsidise those producers to get into viable, ethical production of food that is long-term, sustainable. And I guess the other benefit that this government certainly won't be moved by is that it'll also have a positive environmental impact. If you lessen animal agriculture, you'll need less land, less water, and of course what is very important to us is that there's less animal cruelty. The less animals you're slaughtering, raising and slaughtering, producing, breeding just to raise them, to kill them, feeding them, more grain than you could feed the people that are eating the animals with. It's just crazy making.
Is there anywhere in the world that you think is a leading light, or that is doing things in a way that you'd look to model here in Western Australia?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I know the Party for the Animals is doing some great work in the Netherlands, and probably you would focus on Europe to look for those countries that are leading the way in alternatives. But I think really what we're waiting on in Australia and the rest of the world is that development of the cell-based meat, where you have the animal flesh without the slaughtered animal, and even I know there's someone working now on cow's milk without the cow, so they're using the same protein, the same cells, they're creating milk, but they don't have to breed cows, raise them, milk them to death, steal their calves and to get the milk. So I think we just have to do it all smarter. People can still eat meat if they want to, that's animal based, but they can do it without slaughtering animals, and they can do it, it'll be cleaner, greener, have less environmental impacts and less health impacts and less cruelty.
Then if there aren't any countries, we'll say, that are absolute leading lights, have there been any initiatives, or have there been any kind of wins locally here in Australia, federally, where you would go, that was a monumental...
Federally? No, there have been no wins federally that I can remember. Only recently the ALP has committed to phasing out live sheep exports, but is still supporting live cattle exports. But while we have a Liberal national government, that'll never happen. It's yet to be seen if the Labor government's return to federal power, if they'll uphold that promise. I can't think of anything good that's happened federally in the last 2 terms.
Yeah. Can you take a step back and give us some context? Like live export was a big issue here in Western Australia. It's something that a lot of people have been talking about. Can you frame it for me from your perspective? Like, what was the issue? What were the approaches and the solutions that were being offered by both sides? And where do you think the situation is at the moment?
So the problem is, as we said, that you can't. There's no way to humanely take animals from pasture, feedlot them, to acclimatise them to pelleted feed, put them on a ship and transport them often for up to 28 days. The average is around, say to the Middle East, the average is around 15 to 20 days. In rough seas, 24/7, engine noise, ventilator extraction noise, fluoro lighting, and then heading into the Middle East, whether it's summer or not, it's hot, it gets hot. Sheep can handle heat, but what they can't handle is humidity. So then we have the influence of the wet bulb temperature. When the wet bulb temperature gets over 28 degrees, sheep suffer. The government has always maintained, and the industry has always maintained, that it can be done better. And our argument is, well, if it can be done better, why isn't it being done better? It's only under the threat of closing the industry down that they've decided, right, let's lessen the stocking density, let's load healthier sheep, and let's have independent observers on board, and let's take better care of them. Like, why weren't they always doing that? A moratorium came into effect which banned the export of live sheep to the Middle East from the 1st of June to the 17th of September. When the last shipment that went out this year, before that moratorium kicked in, they called a success because only, I think, 81 or 82 sheep died out of 56,000. But what came back from the independent observer was that a large percentage of those sheep got to heat stress scores of 3 and 4. Now 5 is death, 4 means open mouth panting and much distress, and 3 is a little less than that. And the wet bulb temperature did indeed exceed 28 degrees. I think it got up to 32 or 33. So even when they did everything right, they didn't ship during that high-risk period. They reduced the stocking density even further. They loaded healthier sheep. They were all shorn. Even then, there was a lot of sheep that suffered, but they called it a success because they came off the ship at the other end. So our argument is, it's a small industry. It doesn't contribute a lot to Australia's gross export profit. Not a lot of producers rely on it for more than, I think, 5% of sheep and cattle producers rely on it for more than 50% of their income, and mainly the sheep production is in WA. So we're saying, let's give them alternatives. It's not a huge industry. If those countries, all the countries we export live animals to, already import chilled beef and or sheep meat, except for Israel. So there's no religious argument, there's no refrigeration argument. It's ridiculous to suggest that the oil-rich Gulf countries don't have refrigeration. I think they'd be mortified to think that anyone thinks that. So really it's just a few people making profit, and that's mainly the export companies, only one of which is based in Australia. So we're exporting jobs, we're causing animal suffering, to prop up a few export companies that are getting rich on the back of exporting live animals.
And so a solution for this, having not spent a huge amount of time personally thinking about this issue, the obvious question for me is, why aren't we setting up facilities to do that processing in Australia and creating more jobs here?
The industry argument is that the slaughterhouses that we currently have in Australia, the AMIEU, the Australian Meat Workers Union, will tell you that a lot of meat workers lost their jobs when live export started up. They support a ban on live export, but the industry will tell you that if they stop live export overnight, they wouldn't have, or even if they phased it out, they don't have the workers in Australia to man even the current rosters that slaughterhouses have, so they can't find people who want to do the work, unsurprisingly. It's not a great job. So that's their argument. Like I said, every country we export live animals to, except for Israel, already imports chilled meat from animals, but at a higher cost, and they pay Australian production costs, which are apparently the highest in the world. Like Australian meat workers have paid the highest wage of anywhere in the world. So no doubt that countries like Indonesia in particular, Vietnam, want to import the cattle, give their feedlotters an income by producing the food that fattens them up, and give their slaughterhouse workers a job by, the task of slaughtering them, rather than paying for all of the meat they import, the Australian production costs. So they import some chilled. That just rules out the religious requirements and the refrigeration requirements, but it doesn't rule out the fact that Indonesia will never replace all the live cattle they import with chilled, because it supplies them with job opportunities for their citizens. And so, in the case of the Middle East, it's not a religious requirement, but it's a preference.
Yeah. This is a great example of the sort of issue that your party has, that on paper and when it's presented will get a lot of support from people, but then when it gets into the nitty-gritty of how solutions will need to be implemented, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Are there other organisations, are there any industry organisations that you're working with? Like, who else does animal justice liaise with or talk to about what it is you might be able to do? Because your solution, you can't provide the solutions yourself. You'll need industry to work with you. Are there other groups who are doing that interfacing into business, or trying to put forward arguments as to why ethical business might be a good decision for a company?
We work with all of the the major animal protection agencies. We're constantly having conversations with other political parties, including the majors. But I think you would need to talk to Bruce, our president, to get an understanding of what all of the conversations that take place. Certainly, they're our policies, and we will always promote them. And in some instances, people say, well, "What are you going to do as an alternative?" For an example, for live export, are you promoting slaughtering them here? It's like, well, no, we're just saying we shouldn't be doing this because it's the worst of the worst cruelty. Let's just stop it. And that doesn't mean we're promoting more slaughter here, because again, we oppose all slaughter. But there must be alternative, viable industries that both the state and the federal government should be investigating to, subsidise those producers who are relying on not just slaughtering animals but exporting them as well. And there's not a lot of them, but the ones that do, subsidise them to become involved in a more viable ethical industry that isn't ruining, the planet, the environment, habitat, species contributing to species loss, all of that. It's a win. We see it as a logical solution, a logical step. It's a win for the environment. It provides more jobs in Australia. But I think all governments really are very short-sighted when it comes to, they've only got a 3 or 4 year term. They're not looking at 20 years down the track or 10 years down the track even. Yeah.
So bringing it back to to state politics in Western Australia, just having a look at some of your key policies in WA. And what I want to talk about now again is the challenges that you have with some ideas that will be well received conceptually, but then implementing them, and the challenges that you face in practice. So like ending greyhound racing is one of your big ones. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people will, greyhounds are one of the most recognizable dog breeds, well renowned for being placid and very relaxed. And I have some friends who have taken in retired greyhounds, and they are one of the most chilled out, beautiful dogs that you'd ever find. And so when you put forward the idea of ending greyhound racing, I think one of the things that will come up for people, they'll go, yes, I can see how it's not fair that we would be expecting to run these animals in this particular way, but isn't this what they've been bred for? Don't they enjoy running? They enjoy this life. This is what they're designed. They've been selectively bred over generations to be optimized for this particular activity, and now we're going to suggest that they all take early retirement. Is this what the animals want? How do we know that this is what the greyhounds want?
Well, we wouldn't dare to speak for the greyhounds, but I think the misconception here is it was good that you said they love running. They do. They love running. That doesn't necessarily mean they love racing against other greyhounds, you know, with muzzles around a circular track. That's not a natural behaviour for them to run in large circles, putting all that pressure on one side of their body. You can still have a greyhound and take them to the beach and they can run and express their natural behaviour, which is also, you know, it's either running flat out or sleeping on a lounge. And I don't know that you know, it's getting better that greyhounds are well recognised as one of the most placid, laid back, you know, chilled dogs. They don't need a lot of exercise despite their size. But for a long time, because of the industry, you know, because they were bred for racing and they were often bred by being blooded or baited with small animals, that was what enforced that regulation that requires them to wear muzzles, so they didn't chase, you know, smaller dogs, cats, whatever. But if they haven't been blood or baited, you know, they're sight dogs, they can each be individually assessed to see if that's going to be an issue for them. But there are a lot of greyhounds that, you know, will sleep with cats or not chase any smaller animal. So most people, I think, when they meet greyhounds, they come to understand, you know, that they're not an animal whose purpose is to race. That's purely to make profit for someone, to gamble on. You know, it's also an unhealthy thing for the human, for humans to, you know, become involved in that gambling industry. So I think most people oppose forcing an animal to do anything that's not in its natural behaviour. Horses like to run as well, but there's no, you know, and if it was a fair race where you just let them go and they run and they race and the fastest horse wins, that's fine. But they're drugged, they're trained, they're ridden, they're whipped. Their lifestyle is not natural, and it's the same with greyhounds who are involved in the industry. You know, they're kept isolated, they're trained, living quarters are often beyond ideal. And, you know, I'm sure there are some good greyhound trainers, but there are also some pretty shitty ones. And the ones who don't make it end up in mass graves, as we've seen in Queensland and New South Wales, and the horses that don't make it end up in knackeries and slaughterhouses.
Mm. With these industries, with greyhounds and with the horse racing industry as well, another challenge that I think people have is when it's brought up, but what we're alluding to here is that these industries in and of themselves, they're, you know, you would put forward that they're morally questionable, given that they're based on the exploitation of these animals. Mm-hmm. But the people involved in them have dedicated their lives to these industries, and they believe that they more than anybody, having worked with these animals all their lives, have a unique insight on what these animals want, and they will accuse you of not understanding these animals in the same way that they do, and then it becomes a personal thing, because you're no longer just talking about the state of the industry, but you've brought someone's life's work into the equation, and you're undermining the basis upon which they've built their life's work. Have you had that sort of resistance from people?
Sure. On, you know, greyhound pages, you always get the people from the greyhound industry coming in and arguing with you. I mean, it suits their purpose to have that unique insight into what greyhounds love. But if greyhounds didn't love running, they wouldn't have a business. So their insight has come about through finding a way to make a profit. That is, you get an animal that loves running, you force them to race, and you make money from it. And then your insight becomes, but they love to do it. And that's because it makes them money. And the same with, you know, horse owners. And they say they have the best understanding of the animals and they take amazing care of their animals. They do it because they run in the best condition. But if they get an injury, they don't take good care of them then. They have them put down. They have them shot on a track or, you know, knocked on the head and buried in a mass grave. So it's not any love of the animal or any insight into their that peculiar breed or species, you know, horses or greyhounds or, I don't know, people who race camels. There's a profit to be made. That's human nature. When you mix animals with people who like to make a profit, the animals are always the losers. There's no industry in which an animal is commodified or exploited where the animal comes out better or has a better life than if it was just left alone? Nothing.
In thinking about greyhounds, racehorses and camels there, something that comes into my mind is the concept of tradition, and how a lot of these, like especially racehorsing and camel racing, like racehorsing is known as the sport of kings. You know, like what a name to, or a trademark to put on your sport. And the fact that in Australia, and where I come from in Ireland, I'm from a place called Galway, and every year there's Europe's biggest horse racing festival. Now, I've been to the Galway races countless times growing up. In recent years, I found myself kind of, questioning it more from a, this isn't anything novel or that interesting or unique. It really is just a tradition that has been established, and now there's a name associated with it, the Galway races. And in Australia, a perfect example is the Melbourne Cup. Mm-hmm. There's a huge hullabaloo made every year in workplaces about the Melbourne Cup, and people get dressed up and people go to the horse races, etc. And I don't think that the majority of people actually have any interest in the horse racing whatsoever. But there's a tradition there. There's something, like there's a shared experience that people know. We know what this is. We know we can go to this place. We know what will happen. And I find that with ideas like that, where there's no longer any thinking involved in it, where it's just become a part of the culture, it can become very difficult to shift or challenge people's behaviors around that.
Sure.
Tell me about your experience every year when the Melbourne Cup comes up, because I imagine it's just like Groundhog Day every year.
Well, for many years we did, we had a presence outside Ascot Racecourse in Perth on Melbourne Cup Day and Perth Cup Day, and what you said then is exactly true. A lot of people going in, particularly the younger women with their fascinators and dressed to the nines, said, "Oh, we're not having a bet, we're just going in to have a drink and a meal," or whatever. It was the occasion. So we're saying, well, if you're just going in for the drink and the meal and to dress up, why do you have to whip horses round a track for you to do that? Can't you do that any day, anywhere else? Seeing humans perform music, or I don't know why. Why does it have to involve animal cruelty? And I think a lot of them get that, but they don't get that going to the races and not actually having a bet on a horse racing still props up the industry with the money they spend on food and drinks. I think there's much more awareness now, because a horse or two has died pretty much every year for the last 5 or 6 years in the Melbourne Cup. And I think people who thought it was once maybe a one-off and it wasn't exposed, as it is now by groups such as Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses and the Animal Justice Party and Animal Liberation, I think people are much more aware that this isn't just a harmless race, and it isn't just about people having a flutter and having fun. Animals are being, whipped and suffering injuries or dying or ending up at slaughterhouses, all because people want to make a profit from racing them around a track.
How would you suggest, I've been to a number of workplaces where there is a big, big kind of celebration around Melbourne Cup, and the workplace adapts that week to, for people to spend time watching the race that stops the nation, etc. Now, it's also the time when activists are, most vocal about things, and I think that in a way it's sometimes counterproductive to activists' causes, because the worst time, in my view, the worst time to try and have a discussion with somebody about their food habits is when they're hungry and they're about to sit down and have a meal.
Sure.
And the same way, the worst time to have a discussion around the role of horse racing as a concept or as a cultural phenomenon is on that one day of the year when people have dressed up to enjoy themselves, just like to check out of whatever it is they're going through in their lives and just have something else that they can engage with for a few hours, and then they're made feel bad for partaking in watching a horse race and having some snacks on the side. Do you think that, am I correct in that? Do you think that there is a more opportune time to have this discussion, But at the same time, I recognise that you can't just let these things slide and say, oh, we'll continue to advocate for this cause tomorrow. When
I think there's a difference between giving people information that they can look at in their own time, or interrupting the fun they're having or the enjoyment they're having, whether it's at a Melbourne Cup sweepstakes watching the race, or in a restaurant eating animal products. I'm very opposed to some of the actions that have been done in Perth lately by groups that go into restaurants and shame diners while they're dining. No one decides, oh, I'm going to become plant-based because these activists have just come in and shamed me in front of my grandmother and my child. I'm of the opinion that it might turn people who may have once had a logical, reasonable conversation about veganism or plant-based diets away from ever having that conversation because they were shamed by these, vegan activists, as they're called by the media. Nearly all activism is good, but you've got to weigh up the risk versus the gain. And I think when you turn people away from your cause, then it's counterproductive. I know that in regard to the races, a lot of activist groups now, or sanctuaries even, Animal Justice Party is not an activist group, but we have a lot of activists as members and office bearers, have moved to giving people an alternative, having up to the cup parties where you dress up and you drink champagne and you eat cruelty-free food and you watch humans race in silly suits or whatever. So you still have fun and the enjoyment, but you always give people that information that this is what happens in horse racing. This isn't going to happen here. You don't have to have animal cruelty involved to have a fun day.
Yeah. That really good point there about how shame is a very, in my view, a very poor motivator for people to change their behaviour. But so often it is the lever or the stick that's used by causes. And I think that I believe that it's counterproductive in a way, because if I try to shame you for your behaviour, all I'm really doing is just demonstrating my moral superiority and going, I'm better than you, and I know why I'm better than you, and this is why I'm better than you, and the sooner you realise it, then the sooner you can be better than someone else.
Yep.
And it's a chain reaction that, at each of these steps, I don't think the person goes, oh, now that I've felt this huge amount of shame, I'm going to change my behavior. The reaction is generally, oh, I feel this shame. I'm going to push against whatever it is that's causing me this discomfort, and more likely even double down on my original position and just don't want to know.
Absolutely, what we're seeing in the public's response to some of these actions that involved, invading restaurants or, to a lesser degree, supermarkets and, shouting at people or going in with a megaphone, upsetting their meals. I don't like to see people eating animals, but most people do it. And I think the best way to get them to change is to give them the information, supply them with the knowledge they need to make an informed decision, lead by example. And what we've found with a lot of these actions is that within our own little echo chamber of veganism and activism, everyone around us supports our view. But when you move outside that echo chamber and you look at the general public, all of the comments that come in are, next time I go, I'm going to order 2 steaks, or I'm going to go home and eat double the amount because that really pissed me off. When they did one at Vince Scareffa's butcher shop in Inglewood, he got all these people coming to his shop to support him and buy more meat because the bloody activists were there, upsetting Vince, who was a local authority. Now, activism is good. You have to get the truth out. You have to tell people what's happening in intensive farming, what happens to animals when they're raised, when they're slaughtered. Give them the truth. But if you shame them, it's not going to get them onto your side. It's going to turn them away from you and your cause.
And that issue, I think, cuts across a lot of different activist type causes as well, where it's grounded in that shame culture. But I want to contrast it with the actual values of your organization, because that's not what you're about. Your organization is very much about, one of your values is rationality.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain, before we get into that, the 4 values of your organization: kindness, rationality, non-violence, and equality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, four words or concepts that I think anybody would be able to get behind. But can you explain in this context why you choose rationality as one? Because most people would say, I'm certainly a rational person. This is something I can absolutely get on board with. How do you frame that from Animal Justice Party perspective?
I think rationality is also often goes hand in hand with science. Like, we look at the science-based evidence to back up a lot of our policies, why we have the policies we do on energy, on green energy, on renewable energy, why do we have the policies we do on pollution and waste, and even on lab-grown meats and everything to do with the environment, is that the science says we need to make a quick change. So all of our policies, none of them are, even though it's an emotional issue for many people, what happens to animals in Australia, we take the emotion out of it, and we think that all of our policies are backed in science and logic, and they're very rational, and anyone who looks at them can't really find fault with them unless they are, or they know someone who makes a profit from animal abuse or exploitation or harm. Then you wouldn't call us rational, because we're taking a livelihood away from you. But your livelihood is not in the best interests of everyone in Australia and all the animals that live here. So I guess rationality, most people who are left to centrist would find our policies, rational. We tend to attract left-wing voters more than right-wing voters, though many of the Liberal voters deplore animal cruelty as well. It's a universal thing. You don't have to be left-wing to care about the environment and abhor animal cruelty. So I think that's the rationality. We don't want. But I guess it depends who you are. Maybe if you're a right-wing nutter, you're not going to think we're at all rational.
Well, that's it. It's unfortunate that rationality is subjective. When it's spoken about on a personal level, it's only when you'd be able to, you really have to deconstruct everything and lay it out and go to great lengths to identify, this is what this sentence means. Are we clear on all the definitions as to what these words mean and how they come together to form a sentence, and we all extract the same meaning from it?
Yeah. Right.
Because an awful lot of the time you can have the exact same sentence, and depending on your background or your connections or what your job is, you'll interpret the sentence a completely different way.
Sure. Today I made a comment about dairy, and any vegans that were on the page would have thought, well, that's a really rational, comment, that there's a lot of health issues associated with dairy consumption, certain cancers, acne, asthma, inflammatory diseases, osteoporosis, and the cows and their calves are subjected to long-standing cruelty and sometimes abuse, maybe not intentional abuse, but certainly they're subjected to cruelty. They have their calves taken from them. Many of the calves are slaughtered. Now, any vegan on that page will think that's a very rational, unemotional statement. It's just a statement of fact. But someone who consumes dairy came onto that page and said, oh, here you are, you bloody cult, no evidence to support it, which I promptly provided 52 links to research articles on the harm that dairy can do to the human body. But to her, I was just being irrational. Like, we've always drunk milk. Humans have drunk it for thousands of years. Why would you, why are you saying what you're saying?
Yeah. The one that I heard this line or joke before, it was about who was the first person to discover that humans could drink cow's milk. And what was the conversation that they were having with the person? Was it a dare?
I reckon they were watching a calf drinking or something, or wondering, I wonder if we
could do that as well.
Yeah.
And now it's another one of these traditions. That
it is.
But let's not discount the fact that in times gone by, the quest for us to get enough nutrition and enough calories to survive meant that decisions, you did whatever it is you needed to do.
Sure.
If you needed to kill animals, if you needed to suckle from another animal's teat for their milk, that's what you needed to do.
Absolutely.
But now we live in different times, And I think it's absolutely reasonable for us and rational for us to think about, are there better ways for us to be looking at how we solve our food security issues?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a huge amount of evidence and research in relation to something you mentioned earlier about the amount of grain that's required for animal husbandry to put food on the plate, and the amount of energy intensity that goes into that practice is actually completely suboptimal in comparison to other ways of getting the same nutritional density.
And energy, yeah.
But again, it's just, this is how we do things, this is the tradition, this is what we've always done, and people generally don't like change. Change is challenging, it creates discomfort, and it forces people to go into the unknown. The unknown, and the unknown is where, like, evolution, that's where danger always is. It's much easier to stick with what it is we've known. And one of the things that I love to think about with causes and issues like what it is you represent, or what it is we're at Flux that we're trying to do, is like, what are some of the more incremental steps along the way? Because we could sit here all day and talk about the utopia that you'd like to achieve, inside 10, 15, 20, 100 years, maybe 100 lifetimes, however long it would take. But along the way, there's smaller fights that have to be fought. And, these fights are generally most successful at a local level. So bringing it back to WA and our state election next year, what is it that you're going to be going out talking to people about? Is there anything that you think will resonate with the people of Western Australia in particular that concerns them in this particular election? Or is it just more the kind of the general idea, the big conceptual stuff? Is there any wins that you'd like to try and achieve in the next couple of years in WA? I know that the recent Stop Puppy Farming legislation would be one small little win along the way. Was that something you had input into? And what else do you see being of interest in the coming years?
We did have some input into that with certain people within the party acting with other agencies, but really it was a bill from WA Labor driven by Lisa Baker. But, it's a popular one, and we're trying to have as much influence we can on getting a couple of members in the Legislative Council to vote with Labor on it, because, really to vote against it is to say, no, I'm fine with, what happened to this dog that gave birth to the puppies that ended up in the Claremont pet shop. I'm happy with what happened to her, which was basically she rotted from the inside out and was denied veterinary treatment by the breeder that owned her. So I think that should be an easy bill to get passed in Parliament, except that sometimes the opposition just votes against a bill for the sake of voting against it. Wins we'd like in WA, the first win we'd like is to get a member of the Legislative Council elected. And then I guess the campaigns that we would run on for the WA state election mainly are to do with, land clearing that we've seen in WA a lot, even with the WA Labor government that had a landslide election win at the last election, and therefore had a mandate really to act responsibly, to do things that were environmentally responsible. They got in to some degree on their promise to stop the Roe highway extension and the destruction of the Beelia wetland. So they must know that the feeling of the people in WA is they want to preserve nature, they want to preserve wetlands, they don't want huge roads going through everyone. That must equate to, wanting to save bush, save native animals, stop culling, have responsible housing development that takes into account bush thoroughfares and passages for wildlife, that uses already cleared land rather than clearing more land. The climate change, I know that's a federal issue that's reliant very much on fossil fuels, but it's also very reliant on animal agriculture and methane emissions. So, in WA, there's a lot of country out there that's growing a lot of wheat and a lot of sheep, and we've had the droughts and the bushfires terribly in the eastern states last season, to a lesser degree in WA, but some pretty horrific fires down near the Air Highway. that's going to get worse. What are we going to do to address that? We can't just keep doing what we're going to do. So again, we'd like to look into innovative, regenerative farming, moving away from animal agriculture, moving into crops that can be grown in WA and can offer producers a viable, ethical alternative to raising animals. Just basically preserving nature and rewilding areas where we can. I don't know if you've seen the latest Attenborough film, but basically we're doomed unless we reverse the direction we're heading in and stop clearing land, start planting, preserve nature, preserve wildlife, preserve that balance of ecosystems and the diversity. We just can't keep going the way we're going. So it's a big picture. In WA, it's, little things. Just take care of the bush, stop clearing it, look after the wildlife, maintain the diversity and increase it if we can.
Yeah, I love looking at Google Earth for when we talk about big picture. And the land clearing is one of those things that becomes really obvious when you look at Western Australia on Google Earth. You can see the little pockets that now remain and the straight lines that define the boundaries for these areas. And it's an area that I think that most West Australians would absolutely be on board. One of the things I love about Western Australia and the people here, we have a great affinity for nature. Like everybody who lives in Western Australia, well, I would hope that most have spent a few nights out in the bush. And once you've had those experiences, it leaves you with a sense of, left me with a sense of reverence and awe and just wowness and this feeling of, I have to do this more often. I have to keep going back out into nature. And then you forget and you go back into your life in the city. A few months passes and then you go back out into the countryside again. And you're like, this is amazing. But as you point out, we are doing things to our natural environment that are changing the shape of it. And while it doesn't look that obvious on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis, it's when you start looking at pictures over 5, 10, 20, and even 100 years. When we think about, I'd love to see, on Google Earth, you can look at different times when the satellite imagery was taken. And it would be so interesting if someone was to work out using some other data what things would have looked like 100 years ago or 300 years ago. Because it's not obvious to people who aren't from Western Australia, but we have gigantic forests here, absolutely gigantic forests that once upon a time would have been even more gigantic and would have covered the entire southwest. But so much of that land has been used. I was going to say lost, but it's been used for a certain purpose. Do you think
it's been changed, irreversibly, mostly?
Do you think, is there, every so often on the internet I see stories of these sort of initiatives of planting 1 million trees and so forth. Is there value in something like that, in your opinion, for a place like Western Australia? Or for us, is it more about preserving what we already have?
I'm not an environmentalist or a conservationist by trade. I'm not a scientist, but I do know that there's a correlation between rainfall and and the growth of forests and woodlands and all that. And when you clear land to farm it, for instance, that generally correlates to a lower level of rainfall or a movement in the pattern of rainfall that now falls on the mountains and then hits the plains where all the forests have been removed and kind of stops. I don't think there can be any harm in planting more trees for carbon capture, for increases in rainfall. I don't know if it's too late to do that. Certainly we've got to, if we don't advance in that direction, we have to stop going in the other direction and stop taking trees out. Absolutely. Both for the effect it has on the environment and the climate, but also because of the habitat of a lot of animals that contribute to that beautiful diversity we have in Western Australia, particularly in the southwest, which is one of the world's hot spots for diversity. But the Pilbara, the Kimberley, the Indian Ocean, Shark Bay, the Southwest, we have this amazing state, and we want it to be here for future generations of humans, but also for all the species that call it home, because I guess what I wanted to say is, like, most species protection is because humans have this wonderment or awe around other animals that we share the state with. Really, it's not cruel to see them extinct because they don't know they're going extinct. It's really mostly for a human value that they want to save species so they can continue to see them or look at them or know that we still have them. But the main reason to maintain species and not lose any more is that diversity. The more diversity we have, the healthier, climate and environment and ecology we have. And as we lose diversity and we become more, there's more monocultures and less species and more, one species overtakes another one, it becomes much harder to reclaim the health of nature or the health of that environment that we once had there.
I think it's always worth pointing out when the word or the term biodiversity hotspot is used to remind people that biodiversity hotspot is a bad thing. It sounds like a good thing, but what it actually means is that the ecological systems there are under serious stress and serious risk. But it's something I pointed out in a discussion with someone before. They heard that Western Australia was a biodiversity hotspot, and they thought that was something to celebrate. And it's like, no, we have a lot of biodiversity, but the hotspot term is actually used to distinguish that our systems are actually under serious ecological threat, and it's a bad thing to be a biodiversity.
Okay, that's not how I use it. I use it as in, this is one of the areas in the world where you'll find a huge amount of species that should be there. Yeah. So, you go somewhere else and they've all been decimated, and there's one species that's kind of overtaken. But in WA, we have this Southwest diversity hotspot where there's a diverse range of species that should be there, that are there, both plant and animals. Yeah. That's what I meant.
Well, that's one of those confusing things that happens where we'll hear people talk about the fact that there is a biodiversity hotspot, but from the actual scientific term of it, it's intended to be a warning to people that this is not something good. Right. The number of species that you have here are under massive pressure and at risk of extinction. So I saw it before as I said, when someone was celebrating.
Wouldn't that be a black spot?
Maybe there needs to be more clear terms around it. But being southwest of Australia being a biodiversity hotspot in particular is not one that we should celebrate, because it's actually the incorrect thing to be celebrating.
Okay.
So it's just a strange nuance around the words. Just going to bring us back to some of your policies as well, because you said your objective, like all the other minor parties, is to get somebody elected into Parliament so that you can effect change through the parliamentary systems that you have. Now, looking through some of your policies, I always like to look at policies that on first glance might raise an eyebrow and make someone go, what's involved in that? But when you think through it, you'd go, that seems like it makes a lot of sense, let's implement it. And simple ones like this are banning single-use plastic bags. When you think about that, you go, what does that entail? These plastic bags that we use all the time, we're just, by issuing them at supermarkets and so forth, we're encouraging people to use more of them. If we banned the use of them, we can incentivize other behaviours. Seems like it makes sense.
We got along with them, we got along without them for many, many decades of shopping.
Yeah, and it was something that Ireland implemented the charge on it a few years ago, and I think now we have a charge on plastic bags in Western Australia. Mm-hmm. And even that small little change, you see how it changes people's behaviours. It creates, a plastic bag is 10 or 15 cents. But knowing that the bag is 10 or 15 cents means that people are more inclined to bring their own bag to the supermarket with them. And that in and of itself is such a gigantic change in behaviour from such a small little change in legislation.
It's huge, yeah.
The other one that I think is worth calling out here is banning the use of balloons at outdoor events.
Party poopers.
I know. Why do you always want to ruin everyone's good time?
I know.
Explain what's the risk associated with these balloons?
So a lot of people believe that balloons, float up into the atmosphere and explode and disintegrate and just, go away, basically. But the evidence would dictate that they actually explode and they fall back to Earth, and that's all the little bits of plastic plus the sphincter of the balloon, and which often has a string or a ribbon attached. And things happen like sea turtles mistake them for food, marine animals or marine, bird life get entangled in the ribbons that are attached to the balloons. There's a woman in WA actually who's spent the last probably 5 years of her life investigating this and picking up bits of balloons along beaches and things that are attached to balloons. And, when you release balloons at events or they escape unintentionally from their tethers, they float up into the sky if they're helium balloons, or they drift along on the wind if they're not helium balloons, and they land in the ocean, or they land in sensitive areas, or they land in someone's backyard where a magpie gets entangled. But they inflict harm on wildlife, and they don't break down in a matter of a year or something. Sometimes they take a decade to break down, or longer, depending on what kind of latex they're made from. So they're not harmless, they're fun at the time, but let's look at other alternatives. Let's look at, laser light shows or something that doesn't pollute the environment or cause harm to animals.
Yeah, the reason I bring this one up and why I like it is it represents a small incremental change. There's nothing in the idea of banning those balloons for outdoor events that would seriously impact anybody's life.
No.
It would, yes, you're used to a certain way of doing things. You've always had balloons at your birthday party. We understand that, and that's fine. But I'm not talking to you now, obviously. I'm talking to the hypothetical person who has an objection to it. I think that that's an issue that would have almost zero resistance when explained
Sure.
to someone. But obviously, it's such a low-ranking priority for people that an issue like that is very difficult to get into the parliamentary agenda, or getting a political party to actually bring this to Parliament, which is why I think it's more interesting, because it fits with the idea of what we're trying to do at Flux, with small incremental change that will create a huge amount of benefit, impact hardly anybody, and getting those sorts of changes through Parliament as efficiently as possible, and using Parliament, as we said, to make these small little improvements along the way, like when we know we're pointed in the right direction, as opposed to saying we're going to spend the next 3 years on a gigantic piece of legislation that's going to reform how every child's birthday party, every event, and we're going to put in place strict legislation that will govern every single aspect as part of the party overhaul reform legislation, and will include the banning the balloons as a byline in that.
Yeah.
I would go, we don't need to hold up everything for this gigantic piece of legislation. Let's work through the small little bits one by one and see which we can make progress with.
Right. So here's the evidence. Here's the impact it will have. It'll have an impact on balloon manufacturers, no doubt.
Big balloon.
But do you put balloon manufacturers above nature and wildlife, or do you give them an alternative? Let's get them into manufacturing laser light show, machines or whatever.
I speak in jest now, but obviously if a piece of legislation like this was to be rolled out, you would very quickly be presented with all the mum and dad balloon companies, the mum and dad balloon shops, and there would be, your heartstrings would be pulled on, and there would be pictures of, a 4-year-old twins, and they don't understand why
they've got no balloons
why
at
there's
their
no
party.
balloons at their birthday party, and all of these things would be presented as reasons not to support something like this, and simply because that's the sort of story that would tug on people's heartstrings. And you can imagine a situation where you don't have balloons at your party, and you go, oh, that would be terrible, I feel for those poor little, when in reality it's like, we don't need the balloons. they're obviously just litter. They look good for 30 minutes.
Sure.
The rest, and then they instantly become litter to be dealt with.
And it was okay when, the population of the planet was 3 billion and there was only, like 500,000 people having balloons at their parties. When the population's 7 billion, there's 1 billion people using balloons for every birthday party. It's a lot more balloons. And, if we can't have these balloons, let's truly make balloons that are single use, that last for 24, 48 hours. Stop attaching ribbons or strings to them, attach something degradable that breaks down within, and use them if we have to. But let's just stop doing what we've always done because it's tradition. We've always had balloons at parties. They're killing wildlife.
Katrina, anybody who is working to change people's perceptions around traditions has tough work ahead of them, and I admire you for taking it up. I'm just going to kind of highlight quickly some of your other policies as they relate to WA, and just get you to quickly provide some context for people as to what it might mean. Protected status for the dingo.
Sure. So the dingo is a pretty vilified, I guess you'd say a naturalised animal of Australia and Western Australia in particular. I believe it's found everywhere except Tasmania. Could be wrong. I'm also not a dingo expert. But it's been in Australia for a few tens of thousands of years, we believe, that it came over possibly with with people who were on boats from Southeast Asia. It's our only apex predator in Australia, and when we have healthy dingo populations, we find that we have less what are considered pest species populations. So they keep pest numbers down, rabbits, I don't know what else, foxes perhaps. But what the focus has been on, I guess there's some confusion between dingoes and wild dogs and hybrid dogs. So we have dingoes, which are a pure species, not the wolf species, not the domestic dog species, Canis lupus dingo. Its own species that is naturalised in Australia, has been here for a long time. Farmers, producers of sheep in particular, and to some extent cattle, complain that wild dogs come onto their properties and attack their lambs or their lambing ewes or their calves or whatever. But the science has shown from dingo specialists that dingoes tend not to go after livestock. That's more likely to be hybrid dogs. And those hybrid dogs come about from producers not keeping their own domesticated dogs that they use to round up sheep and such on their property, allowing them to roam. They interbreed with dingoes, and then you end up with these hybrid dogs that run in packs, don't have the same structure to their family units as the dingoes do, and then they go out and they trap and hunt and shoot and poison dingo populations as well as wild dog. There's often a bounty on dingoes, on wild dog heads. And when you destabilise a dingo population by taking out, the alpha males or the strongest lines of that dingo family, they become unstructured, and then that breaks apart even more, and they go off on their own and they interbreed with hybrid dogs. So it really worsens the problem. And some producers have found that keeping healthy dingo populations around the perimeters of their farms actually keeps other vermin or pest animals down, and that they're not really responsible. Apparently it's not their optimal food to predate on fatty lambs or those kind of animals, introduced animals that producers produce in Australia. So what we like to do is follow the science, promote the producers that are using dingoes kind of as pest reduction around their properties. And because they are our only apex predator and they do have that value in keeping down other species that are not good for the Australian landscape, we'd like to see them as a protected, naturalised species that also has great importance as a Indigenous totem for our First Nations people.
Very good. Support changes to the Residential Tenancy Act to rental accommodation to be more accepting of companion animals.
So one of our MPs in New South Wales, Emma Hurst, has recently introduced a bill into New South Wales Parliament to try and get the Strata Title Act changed so that people in strata buildings can have companion animals in their buildings. We don't think that people should be penalised in being forced to go without having a companion animal in their life that is in most cases good for the animal and good for the enrichment of both the animal and the human, because they live in either a strata title or a rented building. So I think the opinion on that is rapidly changing, that people shouldn't be penalised because they're renting and not be allowed to have animals, that companion animals often cause less damage than children, but you can't discriminate against people with children, from renting from you. So as long as there's a pet bond, we think it's completely reasonable that companion animals have the same opportunity to share a rental residence as children do.
Yeah, I know.
Seems logical.
That argument of the amount of damage that's caused to a property, I think you're absolutely right. The effect of a few children would vastly outweigh any damage caused by a couple of cats who might scratch at a door, or some dogs who might chew. Dogs are more likely to just chew on the side of your sofa if you're not walking them regularly enough.
Yeah, or dig up the backyard.
Dig up the backyard.
Always fixable. You don't see, how many dogs do you see drawing on the walls?
Yeah, well, I think in general, the laws in Australia regarding renters' rights are quite poor across the board. There's just a real negligence in terms of how renters are perceived in Australia. It is almost a category of second-class citizen in terms of asking permission for hanging frames is the classic example that's always given. But I think that there is a bigger cultural thing that underpins that in Australia around the ideas around home ownership and the aspiration of that. And then in Australia as well, the category of investment properties and the whole idea around that as investment properties been the average Australian's opportunity to get ahead and to accumulate and store some wealth. And the only way that can be done is by having these laws that protect the investment property from ever getting a scratch on it.
Right, yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of just badly laid out legislation there that doesn't actually, do what it is it's supposed to do. And things get conflated. And I don't think that the property industry is at risk if people are going to have companion animals living in rental accommodation. I think if anything, it would increase the liquidity in the market and allow people to have more access to places where they could rent, which would actually serve to create a more vibrant and functional rental market than the constraints that we have, where people sometimes spend months looking for a place to rent because they might have a couple of animals that they want to house with them. And
then are scared to live in it because they might, mark it or...
I know, heaven forbid.
It's just property. It can be fixed or painted.
We can, we have a paintbrush, we have paint, we have the technology to solve these problems. So Katrina, aside from all of the areas, obviously in relation to traditional animal justice areas and the things that filter and sit around that, you also have other positions on marriage equality, asylum seekers, vaccination, abortion, and voluntary euthanasia. I don't think that there's anything too controversial or too unexpected there, but those are the only areas where you have other positions on matters. Now, if you were to get elected to the Legislative Council, for example, in Western Australia, and you have MPs in Victoria who sit in the upper house, how do you go about formulating a decision on policy that's not related to your core interests or an area where you have established a position on it?
I guess we would default to a conscience vote, and that's happened in Victoria with the recent extension of emergency powers in Victoria in relation to COVID, and then the upcoming Ombudsman's Bill that Andy, our MP in Victoria, is expected to vote on soon. So generally the MPs, if we don't have a policy or position or it doesn't fall in line with our core values to guide them, they vote how they want. And we haven't found any instance, I don't think yet, that an MP has voted in a manner that the party has disagreed with. There's been a few contentious ones, but overall we support their votes. Our members may not. We get a lot of flack and feedback from our members who, threaten to leave the party and never vote for us again if we support the extension of emergency powers bill or if we support the ombudsman bill as it stands at the moment, which is understandable. There's some weird parts of that bill that were of a concern, but the government's decided not to go ahead with the bill without some amendments to it. We would default to a conscience vote. We are always formulating more positions which can be brought to our attention by our members. If they have a position they think that, or if they have an issue they think we should have a position on, we'll consider it. Goes to our policy working group, and we may or may not develop a position on it. Why we have positions as opposed to policies is that there was some discussion in the party several years ago about expanding our policies to include human-only issues. And, we had a debate about that at a couple of AGMs and decided that we would maintain our focus on non-human animals, but that the public also wanted to know where we stand on certain issues. So, we have those 5. We'll be adding more to them. I think coming up soon is corruption, First Nations people. Just when the public want to know when they're voting for us, where do you stand on something? If it's a reasonable, not too obscure issue or topic, then we think it's reasonable to have a position on that.
Yeah. That's
in line with our core values.
Yeah, I draw this out because having read through your charter, 2 things really stuck out to me in there. One, listed as a fundamental factor, you have a fundamental factor for ensuring the success of your objectives is a political system in which participatory, deliberative democracy can be exercised so that citizens have the ability to express their true concerns about the treatment of animals.
Did we steal that from you?
It sounds like you could have, or we might steal it from you, because I think that's a really succinct explanation for what it is we're trying to do. We being Flux and the Flux ecosystem, the Flux system in general, where we want people to participate in having a say and shaping these things. And as we've discussed, there's so many of these areas where people would have a feeling, they would have a preference one way or another on this, but often that these issues just don't make it into the legislative agenda. But people should have the ability to say, yes, I would like for us to have this particular view on this issue. I would like to oppose this particular one. And so I'm going to be putting forward to all of the micro-parties in Western Australia, and we've already started the discussion further afield as well about, with the work that we're doing, we want to empower other minor parties as well to help you fill in the gaps when you're in Parliament on the issues where it's not in your wheelhouse. It might be something that's come completely out of left field, and where there isn't an obvious consensus that would be reflected through your party representative, and where we ask constituents, how should we vote on these things?
That's great.
And it sounds to me like these sorts of initiatives are well aligned with how Animal Justice Party sees how you should be making decisions.
Sure. I mean, that would have come in really handy, for instance, with that extension of emergency powers. Rationality dictated that we support the bill, because if you don't have emergency powers in place in a state, you can't, isolate people who test positive for COVID. You can't, quarantine people. You can't do certain things with businesses that allow them to operate remotely. So it seemed rational to us. But if there was some other issue that came up that wasn't in line with our core values, and we didn't know how to vote or how it best aligned with our core values, it would be great to ask constituents who voted for, Andy, for instance, how do you want Andy to vote on this? As long as it doesn't, it's not contrary to our core values, then to be able to vote that way.
And I think that this presents a really interesting use case of how our version of issue-based direct democracy or semi-direct democracy, how there will be different use cases and nuances in it. So Flux, for example, at the moment, our commitment is whatever the legislation question is, or whatever legislation is put before Parliament, that the constituents would express their preference via the ecosystem, and our elected representative would vote in line with that. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Animal Justice Party have already carved out a certain number of policy positions, based on your consultation with your members, and you would go, this is how we would vote on all of these areas here, mm-hmm. even if our wider constituency was against, if our wider constituency all supported increased funding to greyhound racing. We as a party have carved out that we would be opposed to that.
Yep.
But in areas where we haven't defined all of our positions, we would be potentially open to consulting with all of the citizens of an electorate to find out how we should vote in Parliament. And I think that that's an interesting use case, because you still get to protect and preserve all of the positions that you've worked to identify as being really important.
Sure.
But then you can also demonstrate to people that we can do more than just animal justice and the areas that we have identified. We can be a fully functioning member of Parliament that is more responsive to the needs of the constituents than the big parties who have carved out every single position on every single issue, and there's no ambiguity left. I believe that a much more healthy system for contesting and testing ideas would be one where there are a number of micro parties who have carved out their particular areas, who are competing in those spaces on where you would be competing on the issue of the legislation around recreational hunting, for example, with the party who would support recreational hunting very strongly, and you would do battle in that area, but that you might find yourself reaching consensus on other issues that have nothing to do with that.
It's happened already, yeah.
But one of the unfortunate byproducts of our current adversarial political system, as you pointed out at the start, was that sometimes the opposition just opposes legislation because they're in opposition, not necessarily because they have a rational, defensible opposition to it. And I would love to see minor parties start thinking more about what are the areas that we want to carve out, absolutely, that we have well defined. And now, how do we work with all of the other minor parties and have all of our members and supporters thinking about all of the other things that fall outside of our natural remits? Because there's so much in the political economy. There's so many different preferences, different things that people want, outcomes that people want to achieve, vested interests, that I don't think that it's been properly, I don't think we're doing a great job with just trying to bundle it all into government and opposition and having these two forces fighting each other. Do you have any thoughts on what I'm just kind of rambling about in that regard?
Not clearly. I get that, if you're a minor party and you're like a specialty party, we're not a single issue party. We've got many, many issues, but we're a single purpose party, and that is animal protection, or maybe dual purpose and environmental protection. But, our strengths don't lie in economic policies or trade or anything like that. So if we have bills to vote on that aren't within our scope of expertise and focus, and aren't aligned with our core values, which most things are, even when it comes down to trade or finance or public housing or whatever, you can pretty much align everything with one of those core values when you vote. But if it came to something that wasn't, and think of the expansion of state of emergency in Victoria, I think that comes under rationality. It was rational to extend it, but other people might disagree. So if you can go to your constituents who voted you in, who got you elected into Parliament, who for the most part follow and appreciate your values and your policies, how do I feel about giving the vote to them? I think, otherwise you're assuming that the elected member of parliament suddenly becomes an expert on everything parliamentary and legislative because they're elected, and they don't. They're all just, for the most part, our MPs are activists who suddenly find themselves politicians. So I would be, I can't think of the word, sorry. I would be reticent to suggest that they know more than their constituents on many issues that are going to arise in Parliament. I think certainly we know the most about animal issues, animal protection, animal justice, animal rights, environmental protection. But for all other issues, who's to say that we know better than anyone else?
Really good point. That's something that I absolutely agree with as well, and it's a problem that I think that is solved with the use of delegation to specialists in areas. And as you said, you would have views on certain economic issues as they would relate to some of the issues that you have well defined.
Sure.
But there's other areas where you wouldn't have a well established position, and that's where I think a more well-developed political economy would have the ability for people to easily delegate and partner with other groups to get other things passed, but without us having very hard and fast ideological lines drawn where it's like, we will never work with that group because they're opposed to us on an issue over there, over here. We can't be seen from an optics perspective. Like, there's so many political parties who, from an optics perspective, will refuse to work with somebody where it's in their mutual interest simply because of how it could be perceived or used against them by their opponents.
Sure. No, we'll work with anyone. And I don't know if I said this to you earlier, but you often hear in certain states the Greens being called the party of protest because they will just they'll oppose what the major parties or the ruling government will put forward. And the Animal Justice Party is becoming known as the party of progress because we won't vote based on who's tabling the bill or who's behind it or whatever. We'll vote on the facts. We'll look at the bill. Is it beneficial for animals? Is it, does it harm animals? Is it good for the environment? Is it bad for the environment? Is it good for people? Is it bad for people? And it doesn't matter who bought the bill, whether it's the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party or One Nation or Australian Christians. If they bring a bill and it makes sense and it's rational and it doesn't cause harm to animals or the environment, and it helps or assists people, we're not going to go with the government because we want to be on their good side. We'll vote according to our values, and if it doesn't align with them, then expert advice.
Yeah, very good. Katrina, on that note, that was a great way to just kind of wrap up on principles of progress and rationality, spaces where we very much overlap and have a huge amount in common. I just want to thank you for your time today, and I look forward to more conversations in the future.
Thanks again very much for having me. It was a great conversation to have.